Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Learning Curve. I am your host, Julia McLeod. Before we begin, please join me in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, enable me to teach with wisdom, for I help to shape the mind. Equip me to teach with truth, for I help to shape the conscience. Encourage me to teach with vision, for I help to shape the future. Empower me to teach with love, for I help to shape the world. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. We would like to take a moment to reflect on the events of our history that have led us to gather today for the purpose of learning together. This traditional territory on which we record is of the Indigenous peoples of the Treaty 6 region and the Métis settlements of Métis Nation, Alberta, Regions Zone 2, 3, and 4. We're recording again from our beautiful studios here at Lumen Christi, our common home in Edmonton Catholic Schools. Today's episode is supporting success for our language learners. The agenda for the episode today begins with our TSA segment, Tricky Situations in Assessment, with our Director of Curriculum and Assessment, Nicole Lafreniere. In this segment, Nicole will help us navigate and land on solutions to difficult situations in assessment. We'll follow this with an interview with Vanessa Gavin, one of our English as an additional language consultants. She'll speak to us about language learners and how we can best support them. We're going to cut then to our segment, We're Still Doing That, with Deputy Superintendent Tim Cusack. Tim will help us explore outdated assessment practices and offer solutions to help us move forward. And we're going to conclude it today a bit differently. We're going to add in a second interview with Stephanie Winters, our French language arts consultant, and she'll explain to us a bit of how the French Immersion curriculum is constructed and how those outcomes can actually help us conceptualize teaching and learning for language learners. So that's the plan for today. Let's jump right in.
A parent calls you upset because their child is struggling with their mental health symptoms, which means that their work was handed in late, which resulted in the teacher deducted 10% from the total possible score for each day late. The parent has contacted the teacher, who will not budge their policy. When you speak to the teacher about it, they tell you, if I don't do this, they'll never hand it in before I give the other papers back, so then they'll cheat. It's not fair to the other kids. What do you do?
So I think that in this particular case, and I'm not saying that it's not tricky, but I think that there's lots of different things that are compounding the issue. When we get to the very heart of assessment, the very heart of assessment is outcomes-based assessment. What does the student know? What are they able to do in relation to the outcome? And we want to be very careful that we don't conflate behavior with grading, that we're not confusing a mental health perhaps issue or physical health issue with grading. Grading is a very different thing than those other issues. So while it can make it more complex, certainly that this student is struggling, at the heart of the matter, we can't penalize students through a grade. The challenge as an administrator is that we're going to be challenging people's beliefs about grading and beliefs about what is fair and not fair. And that is a difficult line to walk sometimes. Ultimately, though, we have to behave in the best interest of the student. So what is in the best interest of a student at any time, whether or not it doesn't matter really if they're struggling with their mental health, although that does come into play in this particular scenario. But in the best interest of the student, what mark best represents, or what evaluation best represents what that student knows and is able to do? That's ultimately the mark that should be in the grade book. Then we need to have a conversation about, what do we believe to be fair? Is everybody doing the same thing at the same time the most fair thing? Or is it fair to make accommodations for people who may be struggling? And that's another conversation that we need to have. As an administrator, I have provided sub days for people who haven't been able to make a deadline. I have provided all kinds of different accommodations for my staff members because they have needed a little bit of extra care and attention at a particular point in their lives. I would want the same thing as a parent. I want when my children are struggling, I want people to look at them with compassion and empathy and say, you know what, I know that this really doesn't have much to do with learning this particular science outcome right now, but it has to do with you as a person, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of grace. And so in these particular scenarios, we have to really separate what is important about grading and then what is important about teaching and being really just good to people. And in this particular instance, it's important that that family is given that little bit of grace and that the outcome is assessed separately from some of those other issues.
Welcome, Vanessa, to The Learning Curve. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to jump right into our interview questions, and we're going to kick it off with outcomes-based assessment. So outcomes-based assessment is where students work towards mastery of a learning outcome, and often mastery will look different for different students. So would you be able to speak to how we can build choice into assessment for language learners?
Sure. So while outcomes-based assessment provides the framework, outcomes may be achieved differently depending on each individual student. So we know that in our classrooms, we have varying levels of English language proficiency, learning styles, and cultural background. So it becomes really, really important to build that choice into assessments to give students the opportunity to choose how they're going to demonstrate the mastery of the outcome. So choice is going to allow students to use their language skills in a way that builds on their strengths and interests. The product of any task doesn't need to be the same for all students. Tasks can still be cognitively challenging while requiring different output. One of the ways that I used to do this is through projects. I thought projects were a great way of offering meaningful ways for students to work at their own ability, language, and interest level. Students can choose to demonstrate their mastery of their product through different ways. When I taught Science 9, an example of this, I believe the outcome was something like describe technologies for life in space and explain the scientific principles involved. And I had students pick either a spacesuit or a space station and describe technologies within one of these that would help an astronaut survive in space and describe the scientific principles behind them. So they were able to describe these in a way of their choosing. A lot of students chose to label diagrams and describe it in writing, but I had one student that actually designed a space station in Minecraft. And he did a voiceover and he took the class through a tour of his space station while describing the different technologies. And we took like a little virtual tour of that. So the student met this outcome in a non-traditional way, but I was able to assess his understanding more effectively. He gave me more than I think if he would have had to do it all in writing. So even in terms of providing very different scaffolding tools and strategies, giving students choice in these as well. So teaching students how to use different types of graphic organizers and providing even sentence frames that students can choose to use in class discussions or in their written work.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example you shared with us, really seeing how projects can really open up those outcomes for different ways of representation for all of our students, our language learners especially.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. I think it's great for our listeners to hear that happening live and in action and something that you've done in reality and how it influenced our students. So I think this leads into our second question. So how does choice in demonstrating their progress towards a learning outcome help language learners develop a growth mindset and become more self-directed learners?
So the research shows that when students have choice, they are more engaged, they feel more confident, and they tend to perform better. So showing students that they have some control over their learning process helps develop that growth mindset where students view challenges as opportunities for growth. When language learners in particular are offered a variety of assessment options, they can build on their strengths and interests and use them to their advantage. Some students we know may rely on their first language a lot in our classes, and they might benefit from using audio translation to verbalize their knowledge. So, for example, on the topic of Science 9, if a student was required to explain the operation of telescopes, they could use the talk and type feature in the Read Write for Chrome toolbar as an option. They could change the input language of the microphone to their first language, record their explanation in their first language, and then translate the document back to English so that the teacher could assess their understanding. So giving students some of that control and how they present the information and leveraging their first language can be huge for our English language learners. And giving them this choice helps them to become more self-directed because it forces them to reflect on their learning and determine the best way to demonstrate their understanding. They can practice making informed decisions and taking responsibility for their learning in that way.
I really like your idea of control. Just thinking about my own experience, I know that when I don't have control over a situation, I'm not quite motivated to do the task, like especially if it's something that I have to do, like tax season. When I have to do taxes, it feels outside of my control,
Right.
and I'm not motivated to doing it. I can only imagine a language learner, the lack of control that they're feeling, especially if English is such a struggle for them. So giving some control. All right, that brings us to our last question for today. Can you discuss the importance of clear and measurable language learning intentions and how they support language learners in setting and achieving their goals?
Sure. So firstly, I think that this is important both for teachers and for students. In each lesson that we teach, as teachers, we need to be looking at the language demand of that task. We need to think about what the language demand is and how might our language learners find that challenging. Once we understand these language demands, we can start to think about how we're going to put specific strategies in place to help with that demand. Maybe we're going to use sentence frames to help reduce that language pressure while still allowing students to answer content-based questions. Maybe we're giving some students our visuals. For example, when asking students to state a prediction and a hypothesis based on background information, we're looking to assess the student's knowledge. However, recognizing that this is a huge language demand on our English language learners. So we can frame that sentence and for them so that they can respond with their ideas but reduce that language pressure. So in this case, we could frame a sentence frame like if, then, based on. And having these clear outcomes for teachers helps us to develop these appropriate learning materials and activities for students to feel confident and successful. It helps our language learners set goals and track their progress and stay motivated throughout the learning process. When they see their progress and successes, they're going to be more committed to that learning goal. Clear and measurable language learning outcomes gives language learners a clear understanding of what is expected, but also what they can expect to achieve. This is going to help them reflect on their learning, which will in turn build confidence, motivation, while encouraging them to continue to work towards their goals.
Yeah, I think some of our listeners are familiar with the concept of cognitive load, and the cognitive load is high for our language learners. So we want to reduce that as much as possible, and we can do that through learning intentions, right?
For sure.
So how can students know where they are at in their journey towards mastery, really? So I saw that you brought a book today.
I did.
Would you like to speak to it?
Sure. So this book is called Unlocking English Learners' Potential, and it is a great book. It has all different kinds of strategies for making content accessible when it comes to our English language learners. So if you're looking for more strategies for your classroom, it's a great book to check out.
Great. I think we're all looking for strategies right now, especially as our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse and we're seeing that diversity. How do we support and change our practice? So with your time in the classrooms, is there anything that you're seeing that you'd like to touch on before we leave today?
Sure. So one of the questions our department has been getting a lot and ongoing throughout the years, the use of the ELL special code in Power Teacher Pro. And the answer always comes down to, what does the outcome ask of our students? If we are changing that outcome in some way for our students to be successful, then that's when we would use that ELL special code, because they're no longer achieving the outcome in the way that the outcome is written. We're changing it for them to be successful. So that's one thing that I wanted to highlight. And also, students using their first language, especially if the outcome doesn't specify what language the student is to achieve the outcome in, is okay, and that's an accommodation.
Yeah, like in mathematics, nowhere in the curriculum does it say that math has to be taught in English.
Right.
Right? We teach it in French immersion, we teach it in Spanish bilingual programs, Ukrainian bilingual programs, German bilingual programs. So math doesn't need to be taught in English. So
Sure.
if they're responding in their language, it's not an accommodation.
Absolutely.
Or it's not an adaptation.
Right.
It's an
It is an
accommodation.
accommodation. Yeah.
Not an adaptation. So you brought a book with you today. Would you like to speak to how you've been using it or how you think it's valuable for teachers?
Sure. So the book here is called Unlocking English Learners' Potential. And what I really like about this book is it's full of strategies in how to make content more accessible for our English language learners. So if you were wondering how to do that or looking for some more strategies, it would be a great book to have a look at.
Yeah, awesome. I think we're all looking for strategies, especially in these times where our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse. And how do we handle this as teachers and educators?
For sure.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that today.
Thanks.
So that's the end of our interview. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for being with us today. And
Thanks.
we're going to cut now to a fun segment we call We're Still Doing That with Tim Cusack.
What? Are we still doing that? Stop it. If we only rely on one primary form of assessment, for example, if I only use quizzes, quiz 1, quiz 2, quiz 3, quiz 4, quiz knows, kids feel toasted. It's not better. We need to look at a more robust process for understanding what students know, understand, and are able to do. So we really want to diversify the assessment profile and portfolio, so to speak, of every child. Have you had an opportunity to see them act out a concept, work in a small group, do a presentation, give a speech, create an expression, a visualization, a graphic, a podcast, write a poem, be involved in a play, look at evidence of their writing, a journal entry, not just one test or one quiz. So when we think of that triangulation of evidence, we really want to give our learners an opportunity to express their understanding across a myriad of modalities. There are multiple intelligence. Research tells us that not every child is wired the same way. And so we need to be cognizant of different learning tasks. Now, that said, if a student has a preferred modality, sometimes we can support or help them with that if that's the best way for them to exemplify their learning and understanding, particularly when we get to summative assessments. For example, some students may really struggle with verbalizing or writing an answer that they really need to share. Maybe it's a conversation. Sit down and say, tell me what you know about this, or talk to me about that, and use mediative questions to draw out their understanding. There are a variety of ways to understand a child's capabilities within the content. So let's think about ways to do that and not just be that one trick pony that it's just quiz, quiz, quiz. We need to stop that, but over to you. What do you think would be helpful?
Welcome, Stephanie, to the Learning Curve. It's wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Can you speak to how the outcomes are organized in the French language arts curriculum and how this organization supports learning an additional language?
So the way that the French language arts program of study is organized is actually by language domain. So we have outcomes that are directly related to listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And so I really like that organization because all four are so important when it comes to learning a language, and there's specific outcomes for each one. And so then you are required to focus on all four. We have a tendency to want to focus more on the reading and writing, but those oral outcomes for listening and speaking are so, so, so important for our language learners, because that is where they're going to develop their vocabulary and really develop their language to be able to read and write.
Yeah, it sounds like some of the work is already done for teachers in really organizing the curriculum and kind of guiding how those outcomes can be taught to students.
Exactly. It's also a task-based curriculum. So the outcomes are specific tasks that the students are to master at each grade level. And so it can be very prescriptive in that way, but I think that can be helpful for teachers to really know what to focus on.
Yeah, I heard you say mastery. Can you elaborate a bit more on that mastery piece for language learners?
Yeah, so I mean, learning a language is obviously a progression, and we work on skills for many, many years before we're able to actually master them and then to evaluate them summatively. So the outcomes at each grade level that the students are required to master in an autonomous way would be the tasks that we evaluate summatively for them.
I think that leads into my next question. So, when planning a progression around these learning outcomes, what are some best practices that will help scaffold language learners into mastering learning outcomes?
Well, I think the first step is to look at the program of study as a whole, because it's already set up as a progression. And so there are skills and tasks that you can start and introduce to students and work on in guided practice, maybe assess formatively, but then you're not going to assess them summatively on those tasks for maybe another 2 or 3 years. So really to look at the program of study, not just the grade in which you're teaching, but look at it as a whole to kind of see where students should be at. And then once you are working on a specific outcome, break it down and see what do students need in order to achieve that. So for example, if it's a listening outcome to identify facts versus opinions, well, break it down, look at what are facts, look at what are opinions, work on those pieces separately, and then build to that final task.
Yeah, for our listeners who don't know the French Immersion program, it's really built in a way that emphasizes that formative work, that practice that students need to do. There's actually detailed codes of when you introduce a concept and when students should be mastering that concept. So I think that's something we can learn from the French Immersion curriculum about really scaffolding progressions of learning, not only within a grade, but across grades as well.
Exactly. It is so important to know and understand what skills they're bringing with them when you have them, and then what skills they will need to carry them forward. I think other good practices in language learning is definitely to do a lot of front loading of vocabulary and try to integrate other subject areas as much as possible. So as an FLA teacher, being aware of what are the themes or topics that they're going to be looking at in social studies, science, and math can really be helpful, because then you're able to help them with those subject areas, but from a language lens, and giving them sentence starters or expressions that they can use.
How can language teachers incorporate student feedback and reflection into outcomes-based practice to support these learners in their growth and development?
I think that's a really important strategy for teachers to use and to really tap into, is to get students involved in the feedback process. We tend to assume why students haven't achieved, or assume why a student might not have mastered a concept. But when you ask them, I find it's always a bit surprising as to why maybe they haven't understood something. I got into the habit of, if I was giving an assessment or they were working on an assignment, I would always have a question asking them, what was the hardest part, or where did you struggle with the most with this assignment? And it was very informative, because you could really see, oh, okay, I didn't explain this part correctly, or you know what, I realized they didn't have the language proficiency to communicate kind of what they were understanding. And then another thing that I liked to ask students when they were working on reading was, what reading strategies did you use? And so I teach junior high, and by then, they've worked through a lot of reading strategies. And so I really tried to get them to think about which ones were beneficial to them and which ones helped them in which situations and why. If we were reading an informative text, did you read the subtitles? Did you do a scan of the images or diagrams? And then having them reflect back on that so that they're able to understand, oh, okay, that actually helped me understand the text more, or making connections to something else. So I think it's just a really important piece of assessment is having the students be involved in it, and then you can adjust based on that feedback.
Yeah, student reflection on their own learning to inform teacher reflection on that,
Exactly.
that same learning.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this this interview segment. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on or share?
I don't know. I hadn't thought of that. I think when it comes to language, the biggest piece for most students is that linguistics confidence. And so creating that environment where students feel safe to take risks in another language is so important. And that truly is what will help them develop the most in their kind of language learning journey. So to really create an environment of openness and acceptance, and really to help students feel confident as they learn a second language.
Great. Well, I see you brought a book with you. Do you want to speak to it quickly before we sign off?
Yeah. So this one I reference a lot. It's called Vers une approche intégrée en immersion by Roy Lister. And it's about integrating language, strategies, grammar across all subject areas. So in French immersion, we like to say everyone is a language teacher, not just the language arts teacher. And so it's finding those occasions where you can bring in vocabulary lessons, or talk about a verb tense maybe in science because it's relevant to talking about a hypothesis or something. And so it's just got some really good examples how you can integrate that language instruction in all subject areas.
Thank you for tuning in to all of our episodes here on the Learning Curve. Just a reminder, we'll be releasing episodes bi-weekly, with each episode featuring different voices and perspectives in education. Please like and subscribe to this channel to stay up to date with each release. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram at ECSD Learning, our YouTube channel at ECSD Learning 7786, and check out our many resources on our SharePoint site, bit.ly/assessment-ECSD. All 3 links are in the episode description. And lastly, we want to hear from you, both on Spotify and on Instagram. We're inviting you to share your classroom experiences with assessment. We will feature our listeners in the conclusion of each episode. So help us celebrate you. That's our time. See you next episode on the Learning Curve.